Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Ladd Wahlen, who is a fourth-generation potato farmer and co-owner of Roots Potato Chips. Roots Potato Chips is supporting regenerative agriculture with its lineup of single-origin, regeneratively farmed potato chip products. In this episode, we learn how a college research project catapulted Ladd into his regenerative journey, how radically different his farming operations are from his conventional potato peers, and what it's been like to go from farmer to also potato chip manufacturer and CPG brand operator. Ladd's farm is proving that you can build a regenerative model for commercial scale potato production, with the farm boasting 10 times the diversity of conventional farms, a 75% reduction in tillage versus conventional farms, and ground cover 90% of the year versus an average of 33% of the year for conventional farms. The Nature Conservancy has made the Wahlen's farm a demonstration site to help other Idaho potato growers adopt regenerative practices, and Ladd and his family hope that the Roots brand can become a commercial engine that incentivizes those same farmers to adopt these practices while being paid for their efforts. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend Ladd from Roots Potato Chips joining us. So welcome, Ladd.
Thank you, guys. Happy to be here.
We're super stoked to have you. What gets me so excited about Roots is it's one of those categories that everybody participates in. Like who doesn't eat a potato chip, So when we can get Regen into categories that have that much potential impact and audience, I get really pumped up. I also was lucky enough to try Roots for the first time a couple days ago. So thrilled to share my experience. But
let's go.
Before we get too far into this thing, Ladd, give us like the lay of the land. Like, what do you produce and where can people find your products today?
Yeah, so Roots Potato Chip. So we're basically a farm to pouch, single origin potato chip company, better for you potato chip company. We basically do half of our products in food service and half in retail. So we have 5 flavors, 10 SKUs, 5 SKUs in food service, 5 SKUs in retail. Right now, we're primarily just available like in our home state and a couple surrounding states. So we sell like 95-ish% of our product in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Utah. And you can find us anywhere in food service outlets like restaurants, eateries, hospitality like golf courses, resorts. And then on the retail side, lots of independents, co-ops. And then you can find us in select stores of larger retailers like Kroger, Walmart, Whole Foods, and Albertsons. So that's primarily where we're at right now.
Are the food service SKUs actually just also bagged potato chips, Ladd, or are they actually different SKUs? Or it just is basically different because you're selling it at a country club, bar versus at a retail grocery store?
So they're different sizes. So yeah, they're more like they're focused more on food service sizes. They're different UPC codes, different SKUs, same flavors, different SKUs, pack sizes. Okay. Yeah,
got it. Cool.
Let's talk flavors because this is important. People have like diehard potato chip like feelings. So what are the flavor offerings that you all have?
So currently we basically just have 5 flavor offerings. So we have traditional sea salt, we have purple sea salt, which don't confuse that. It's not actual purple sea salt. It's purple potatoes with sea salt on them. And then we have salt and vinegar. We do jalapeno and we do barbecue. Yeah. And we've kind of been all over the board. We've tried like a couple very unique type flavorings and seasonings, but really these standard ones have been the best and they've resonated the best with the consumers as well. And the biggest demander for those flavors for chips for both like retail and the food service side. So we've stuck with those for now.
I'm sitting next to a bag of the jalapeno as we speak, and I'm going to do my best not to break it open and eat it on the podcast, primarily because it's going to sound terrible for the listeners. But I think you hit you got the core. Those are the core flavors that everybody needs. So it's good. I can't wait to try them all.
Yeah. I'm really excited to talk to you today, Ladd, because to me, potatoes are a crop that a lot of people, I think it's really challenging to do regenerative or maybe almost impossible to do regenerative. And I actually think you're proving quite the opposite. And so I really love that you've kind of just taken that challenge head on, and you can speak very specifically to what that journey's been like and what you're actually doing. But before we get too deep in the weeds, so to speak, this is a multi-generational journey for you in potato farming. Take us back to kind of your background, how you started farming differently, and then also maybe how you also started the brand as well.
Yeah, you betcha. So I am actually a fourth generation farmer, like AC, like you mentioned, but basically our family. So for 4 generations, we've been farming potatoes in Idaho. Who would have thought? So it's pretty awesome. I love what I do. I love being raised on a farm. But back in 2012, that's when I graduated from college. So I graduated from college. I came home. I worked on the farm with my dad for a few years. But after a couple of years, we decided we wanted to start our own farm. So my wife and I, we just slowly started to acquire acreage and our own equipment. We started our own farming operations, and we really wanted to diversify a little bit because traditional commodity farming is very difficult. Like prices are very volatile. There's not a lot of outlets, and those outlets are big players. So you're a price taker most of the time when you do commodity farming. So we actually tried to do quite a few different things. We raised some different crops that weren't common for our area. We started to transition some of our acreage to organic. So we did quite a few different organic crops. So really the idea was we just wanted to add a little bit of value to our farm. So basically we thought, well, okay, what can we do for the next step as far as processing? And so we thought about a few of the crops that we raised, but potatoes is primarily our big cash crop. So we thought, okay, well, what can we do here? And potato chips just seemed like the perfect opportunity because there was an opportunity for like a local kind of niche, unique artisan potato chip manufacturer over here. So a little bit of the background story. So once we decided that's what we wanted to do, we went to a commercial kitchen, we rented space, we started a few flavors, and we got some feedback from family and friends. And when it was positive, we were happy. We were like, all right, awesome. I think we're on a good track. So we had a good story. We had a good product. So at that time, we actually decided to put together a small facility, a small production line. So everything is self-manufactured. So currently we self-manufacture our potato chips.
Wow.
And that's basically the origin story of the potato chip company. And then regenerative also plays into that as well, if you want me to touch on that.
Ladd, it sounds like you had almost decided to go kind of vertical integration into CPG before regenerative, or like what was the order of operations there? Was it that you had already kind of been adding more value in the farming and you couldn't realize that in a commodity market, so you had to vertically integrate into your own brand, or like what? Piece that out for me a little bit.
Yeah, they were both very simultaneous. So, so for example, I'll take you back to college. So one of my final research papers, I did it. So just to give you a little back story here. So potato production, conventional fumigation is very common. And so fumigation is basically where you come in, you apply a fumigate, it sterilizes the soil. So you're killing earthworms, microbial life, everything in the soil food web. But it's necessary because there's parasitic nematodes and wireworms that can be damaging to potatoes. So that's why chemical fumigation is so common. It's a very, very common process in potato production. So my research paper revolved around alternatives to chemical fumigation. So one of the things that I researched was biofumigation. So biofumigation, for example, it would be basically you use like a brassica. So there's certain brassicas like mustard or oilseed radish that you plant as a cover crop. And those grow and they mature. And when you decide to terminate them, as these decompose, they release, so like the mustard, the brassicas, they will release chemical compounds, biochemical compounds that are called glucosinolates. And as those release in the soil, those suppress those parasitic nematodes and stuff like that. And there was great results, great trials with them. So it's something that just interested me so much, like these natural methods that we can approach in agriculture to eliminate or reduce the need of a lot of chemical approaches to agriculture. So that was part of the start of my journey or interest in like sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And then, like I mentioned, when we started our farm in, a couple of years after I got home from college. So we dove right into cover cropping, minimum tillage, biological products, compost. So we were right in there. So the regenerative side started prior to the CPG start of the CPG, but basically those two integrated. And as we started the CPG, we were able to tell our story about regenerative agriculture and kind of how that works into our farming operation.
I love that we're talking about parasitic nematodes, and there was another word that you had said before that I've never heard before, like glyca something. This is an episode of learning, which I love. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm always really curious, like, why the individuals on the ground choose to start this new path. I mean, you mentioned the research paper. I'm curious, before you even did the research paper, was there an interest in like an alternative method of farming, like a non-conventional method? And if so, like, where did that stem from?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. So one of those things was, the research paper. I think that was a big part of it that helped me go down a path of looking at natural approaches to agriculture. But like another thing of that, I could probably credit my mom is very into like natural approaches to, healthcare and medicine and stuff like that. So I think when you have a similar mindset, like in one sector, whether that's, medicinal uses or whatever it is, it can apply in other areas in your life too. So I always had interest in that, as well as, hey, what can we do to rely more on natural methods or Mother Nature or whatever it is? So basically the combination of those two things, having that exposure in college and opportunities to learn, and then just kind of those things that my mother instilled in me, made me want to take more natural approaches. So that was kind of the genesis of my regenerative agriculture interest.
That makes a lot of sense. And maybe it's ironic, maybe it's not, but as you said it, the thought came up into my mind. It's like, as we have to prescribe more substances to grow food, we end up having to prescribe more medicine to take care of the illnesses that then causes, right? So if we can go with a more holistic approach in how we grow our food, maybe we can have a more holistic approach with how we treat our bodies after the fact, right? So I think you're spot on. There's definitely some correlation there, not just from like how you approach the world capacity, but like the ripple effects as well. So yeah, just an interesting thought.
Yeah, so that was kind of how we started our regenerative agriculture journey. And it's been really awesome because it's been a big part of our story for our CPG brand. And so we started in 2021 with the CPG brand, and really we've talked about regenerative agriculture on the back of the pack since then, about holistic practices and whatnot. And it's been a fun learning experience. Like I had mentioned before, we actually have ran, so let's see, about 8 years ago, we ran a model regenerative farm for one of the largest corporations in America, like concerning cereals and stuff like that. So we ran that model regenerative farm, and that got us introduced to a lot of practices and how those could work in our rotation. And then in addition to that, we transitioned some organic acreage, and we were increasingly changing and modifying our regenerative practices as well. And then about 2 years ago, we entered in an agreement with the Nature Conservancy. So we currently run a model regenerative potato farm with the Nature Conservancy, and it's been very good and enlightening. We do lots of plot trials and farm trials and stuff like that in regards to potato production. And so that's been very beneficial. So we're very deep into the holistic approaches and regenerative agriculture and potato production right now.
Are they also bringing farmers to see what you're doing there, Ladd, in terms of like the research and trials as well? Like, so it's an educational site as well?
Yeah, for sure. So there's been major collaboration opportunities. So we've held some field days there where we've brought in a lot of farmers. We've done a lot of, like local soil health seminars and stuff like that. We've attended quite a few of those and spoke of those too. But yeah, it's been a great collaborative effort. Lots of farmers have showed interest in it, which I think is very cool. So yeah, it's been good. It's a good opportunity to network and collaborate and discuss those things.
Well, Ladd, I can't think of a better place to be the coolest potato farmer than the state of Idaho. So, I mean, you're primed in the right location. That's
Idaho.
That's perfect. Right? You're just living the dream out there.
Yeah, all the
really
stars
curious,
aligned.
I think this kind of tees up nicely to let's talk about actual practices. Right? Yeah, it's all good things. But give us a quick, juxtaposition of how is a conventional potato grown, and what is it that you're doing that's different, and how does that affect, everything? I guess that's a very broad question. But nutrient density, impact of the land, and the other thing I want to just to like paint the picture, how big is the operation you're farming on relative to like a regular conventional operation?
So it's very similar size. So my dad still farms, and then we farm. We have our own acreage as well. But yeah, we would probably just be considered an average family size farm. But talking specifically about the practices, I'll just try to paint a picture of conventional potato agriculture for you. So generally, the year preceding potato planting, you usually have a cereal in there, like a small grain, because that kind of mellows out the soil. So you have a cereal, a small grain, you harvest it. You come in, you deep rip the land, you water, you chemical fumigate, you deep rip again, then you chisel plow in the spring prior to potato planting. So there's a lot of tillage.
Wow.
There's a lot of chemical fumigation that goes to it. And potatoes, like by nature, they're very invasive. The process or the production of potatoes is very invasive, I guess you could say, because there's quite a bit of tillage, at least in the conventional model. So a few things that I don't think we could say that we have it perfected, but there's a few things that we've done over the years that have shown very promising results. So I'll just give you a few comparisons of what we currently do versus like a conventional model. And I wrote a couple notes here just to make sure I don't miss anything. But for example, diversity, that's one of the big things. So like I mentioned, in a conventional potato crop rotation, like in a 12-month period, you're getting 2 cash crop species. You're getting like a cereal and a potato crop. So that soil is seeing only 2 species, 2 different root exudates in that 12-month period. What we're doing is if we have a cereal, then we're coming in with a 12 or a 14 species cover crop. We're planting that in there, and then it's resting until we have potatoes in there next year. So we're having almost 7 times the amount of species in that 12-month rotation as a conventional rotation. So that means, 7 times the amount of species, 7 times the amount of diversity above the soil and below the soil, which we've seen tremendous benefits of cover cropping. Mm-hmm. Another big thing, which I mentioned, was disturbance of the soil. So like tillage. So we have successfully reduced tillage to like 75% of a conventional operation, which is very big. And I think when you're comparing apples to apples, and a lot of potato farmers question me all the time, they say, okay, well, how do you get to the point where you can reduce tillage? And it goes back to all the other agronomic practices that you're implementing, whether it's cover crops or whatever you're doing to mellow out the soil and implement. But yeah, so we're reducing tillage by 75%, which has been a very big thing. Living roots and armoring the soil. So like in that general rotation of a conventional potato operation, they're having like coverage on the soil and roots probably about 33% of the year. And then we're hitting that 80 to 90% mark of the year where we're having roots in the ground and we're having soil coverage. There's a small window in there when stuff is tilled prior to planting where you don't have coverage, but we're exceeding that by quite a bit. So we're about 3 times the soil coverage and roots in the ground as a conventional operation. And then, conventional operations, they don't implement animals. There's no animal integration. But what we're doing is we're putting on that 12 or 14 species cover crop. It matures. We're putting ruminants out there. So we're putting cattle or sheep out there. They're grazing. We're getting animal impact. We're getting nutrient cycling. We're getting the biology stimulated. So we're incorporating those animals. The other big thing is we don't use any synthetic pesticides. So conventional operation obviously uses synthetic pesticides. We don't use any synthetic pesticides on our potatoes. And then we have a big focus on compost and biology versus a conventional operation that focuses more, on chemical fertilizers and stuff like that. And then the biggest thing, part of it is with the Nature Conservancy, but we're experimenting in a lot of things outside of like monoculture. So we're doing a lot of companion cropping. We're planting potatoes with vetch or potatoes with buckwheat or potatoes with whatever it is, just to see how diversity affects it and what we can do to maybe reduce the need of a monoculture. And then in addition to that, we're doing pollinator strips. So we're trying to attract like beneficial insects so we don't have to rely on any sort of pesticide, whether that be organic pesticide or a conventional pesticide. So quite a few different things that we're doing different, which we've seen very promising results. Like some of the results that we see that I've wrote down is, so like our earthworm counts compared to a conventional field are 3 times higher than like a conventional field. We've seen increases in our fungi to bacteria ratios, which is very beneficial. And we've seen increases in water holding capacity, organic matter, and then microbial activity, which we get from soil tests and Haney tests, is up at least 50%. So there's lots of indicators and metrics that show, hey, this is working. We're seeing positive results. We're seeing good things. So I think we're in the right direction. We're still perfecting a few things, but it's progress over perfection for sure.
2 questions for you, Ladd. That was amazing. And just kudos to you for doing all that and how you could articulate all of it. My first question is a simple one, and my second question is more complex. The first question is, you cannot grow potatoes without tilling, right? Because you have to get them to a certain level of depth. That's question 1. Can you confirm that? And question 2 is, can you talk about a little bit about the sequencing of all those practices? Like, did you literally just adopt all those? Did you do like these couple first, then these few, and then these few? Like, what has that sequencing piece been like?
Yeah. Yep. So to answer your first question, from my experience, there are some people that claim that you can do no-till potatoes, and we have attempted them, but we just haven't seen success. So what we have seen is, like, for example, where we're reducing tillage to a single pass prior to planting versus like 4 or 5 passes, which is conventional. So that's a huge, significant reduction. Mm-hmm. But we have seen there is a certain amount of tillage that's required, just because potatoes require like a fairly loose soil, because you don't want a compacted soil. That'll give you water rot issues and stuff like that, and just issues with your crop. So yes, in my experience, there is a level. Maybe one day we'll get to a point where no-till is possible with like advances in machinery and whatnot. But right now, what I foresee, there is a certain amount of tillage that is required. But how can we reduce that and minimize that? That's the biggest impact. After we initiated our own farm, so probably circa 2015, that's when right off the bat, we were implementing cover cropping and minimum tillage and a big reliance on biology. So like biological products and composting. The other stuff kind of became integrated as I mentioned, as we ran that model regenerative farm, as we began this project with the Nature Conservancy and stuff like that. So stuff has slowly been implemented, and I would never advise a farmer to jump all in on anything. It's very wise to like network and see what works and implement one thing after another.
Well, I got to say, as you were spelling out all the different practices, like I was like chomping to the bed. I just want to tear this bag open. I'm like, I need to eat these potato chips right now. They sound like I just want to support this with everything I have.
Kyle's never wanted to eat potato chips more at 9 a.m. Pacific time than today.
That is the most 100% accurate statement.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention one important part, I think, about our story as well. So a couple of years, as I mentioned, we have some acreage that's certified organic, but just for example, we had a farm that had been in pasture for quite a while. So it hadn't seen cultivated crops for quite a while, but it had cattle on it. So there's animal impact, but the soil had rested for probably a period of 10 years or something like that. So we prepped this ground for potatoes. It was organic potatoes. We applied some compost and one other biological product. And the yield was above average for our county. And our cost of inputs was probably 15% of that of a conventional operation. So it just absolutely blew my mind just to think, okay, so you're telling us that if we can get soil health to a certain point, we can get like crops, potato crops, whatever the crop is, we can get a crop that's so resilient to pests, to disease, that that soil is able to cycle nutrients and have that beneficial relationship with the plant, that we can have this amazing yield and quality. I've never seen quite yield and quality like that. It just blew my mind. But just to think, okay, if this is possible, how can we replicate this system in traditional potato farming? And I don't know if we could replicate it perfectly, because nobody can set aside a farm for 10 years into pasture most of the time. But there are things you can do to promote that soil health and diversity and biological activity and everything that produces these amazing crops. So that's really part of the end goal, is for us to get to that point where we can say, hey, like, this is super profitable. It's good for the environment. It's good for the soil. It's good for the farmer, for the bottom line. But that's really our end goal, is we know it's possible, but how do we perfect the process? How do we get there?
I super appreciate that shared, Ladd. And what I love about it is, I think AC and I both tend to focus a lot on like the agronomy and the cool things that happen. And the fact that there are these like economic cases for why this makes sense, I think is super powerful and super important. And that's the benefit of having like the farmer and the brand in the same boat, right? Because then that margin capture makes it all the way to the end consumer, which is incredible. But one of the things I want to ask you is like you articulated all those practices and principles really, really well. And if you can expand a little bit on some of the environmental benefits or things that you've been able to observe on the land when you started to do these things, for example, keeping your soil covered for roughly like 9 to 10 months out of the year instead of like the average 4 for everybody else. Like what have you seen with your own eyes change on your land when you started to implement all these different practices?
Yeah. So thanks, Kyle. That's a great question. So anecdotally, there's quite a few things that we have noticed. So the first one is probably like we live in a very arid climate. So we get less than 10 inches of precipitation a year. So it's considered a desert for the most part. So there's long periods of time in the winter where if it's dry, the wind will howl and it will blow topsoil for miles. So one thing that we've noticed is you'll drive by a field that we have this cover crop residue that, cattle have finished, but it's still covering the soil, protecting the soil. You don't see any of that soil erosion. That wind comes by, it blows, nothing, you're not losing any topsoil. So that's one of the big things. We have seen a big increase just in general in wildlife. So in biology above the soil, like macrobiology. So if you're talking about, deer or elk or birds or whatever it is, there's just more of, there's a lot more biology above the soil and below the soil. Like I mentioned before, we've seen a lot more larger numbers of earthworm counts and stuff like that. So we've seen big environmental improvements, I think, just from those few anecdotal answers.
I totally believe it, man. And just so like this is my I can't even call it my version of a farm. My front yard, which is very, very small. My wife and I have we've been working on putting native plants in the ground, getting rid of the invasives, and because we want to attract like quite literally more birds. So I've got like a bird feeder out there and we got native bushes. And now almost every morning there are quail in my yard cruising around. Like the birds are starting to stop there and hang out. So I mean, I can only imagine with everything that you're doing on a significantly larger plot of land, like the return of life, like they just know, like they can sense that there's a reason for them to be here, and they just like are drawn to it, which is super cool. I can't imagine what it's like to see that on your land.
It's cool. Yeah, I completely agree. It's very cool. I've done this multiple times, but if you go and if you take a handful of like conventionally farmed potato soil, dirt, it is chalky and lifeless. There's no aggregates. There's no stability, but it's basically a powder. Yeah. Like you could throw it up and go, and it's going to blow away. But then if you take a comparison of soil that has implemented some of the practices that we've talked about, there's aggregates, there's stability, there's organic matter. You got earthworms going through it. So it's a night and day difference. It's super visibly easy to see.
There's one other question I keep meaning to ask you and I keep forgetting, but you've said a couple times, like part of your rotation is to mellow out the soil after the potatoes. So like, what is it that's so hardcore about potatoes and like so intense on the soil that the soil needs to be mellowed after that rotation?
Yeah. So when I say mellow, I mean, generally like when you harvest potatoes, you don't want clods. You want to have free flowing soil. If you have clods, you're going to be removing a lot of topsoil that goes out at harvest time. But generally to mellow out the soil, what you can do is like you can have a cereal crop, like a small grain or something like that has a big root system, and that's going to help aggregate the soil and break up clods and compaction and everything like that. And in addition to that, what we've seen is having those multi-species of cover crops and animal impact, whatever you can do to like get biology turning in the soil, that's going to help mellow out the soil and help the aggregates and stability and everything like that. And at the end of the day, like I said, potato production or harvesting is invasive to a point because you are picking up topsoil, but at the same time, you're trying to pick up the minimal amount of topsoil that you can.
There's something that stuck out to me that I want to double back to a little bit too, Ladd, which is there's this whole conversation around plant-based and how we need to shift diets. And your whole example of like the fertility from that field was from the animal impact, and how you're also incorporating it now. And it's like, if we just farm plants in a production agriculture environment over and over and over again, and we never have that biological impact from the animals, shifting diets is not the answer, because we never have the fertility to grow anything. And eventually that fertility is going to run out if you're just constantly cycling plants. Now, you can cover crop and you can bring diversity and you can bring biology in other ways, but we all know that like animal impact is the best way. And so Jonathan, whatever his name is from Project Drawdown, just been on LinkedIn talking about like the shifting diets thing and how he's not a huge fan of regen ag. And it just triggers me, because it's not about shifting diets. It's about producing food in a more symbiotic relationship between animal and plant, which I'm sure many people could articulate better than I just could, but hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, and I completely 100% agree with the AC. Like animal impact, like in general, we're all about whole foods, which is funny because we got a potato chip company, but we love whole cuts of meat, whole fruits, whole vegetables, everything like that. Whole foods in general. So I feel like a dietary shift from animals is not the right direction, or an agricultural impact shift from animals is not the right direction either. Because just what we've seen, I mean, obviously we know that bison herds, roam the plains for many years. So whatever we can do to copy that or imitate that. And in our rotation in potato production, that's basically how we do it, is we're throwing on either sheep or we're throwing on cattle, and we're getting some of that impact. And I don't think there's any way to negate the positive impacts of cattle. Obviously, you have to do it like judiciously and wise. You can't just do it at any time. But, for example, like when we're doing it, the cover crops have grown, they're matured, maybe they winter kill. We're going to throw cattle out there, and they're going to start eating, and they're going to start digesting, and the whole nutrient cycle process is going to start going. They're going to jump microbial activity in the soil, increase organic matter. There's so many pros to it that I just don't see a system that could run without integrating animals.
Totally agree. And that this makes me want to double back to one more thing before we get more into commercialization. But you had mentioned that there's very little rainfall where you are in Idaho. And I think that
Right.
I don't want to say it's overlooked, but like carbon gets all the we got to sequester more carbon, and like regen sequesters carbon. I think that's really good. But I really think that the water holding capacity is like just as, if not more important than this water piece. And it's a lot easier to measure. So I'm curious from your perspective, like the stat that lives in my head is every 1% increase in soil organic matter equals 20,000 gallons worth of water of additional holding capacity per acre. And for you, like, help me to understand, because you get so little rainfall, once you started to implement these practices, like, are you actually noticing that you're holding water, like more water? Is the water infiltration speeding up? Have you been measuring that over time? What have you seen in that capacity on your farm?
Yeah, Kyle, great question. So, once again, we've seen dramatic increases in like water holding capacity. So just for example, this spring, one of our fields that we put in potatoes, we had this 12 to 14 species cover crop. I can't remember how many it was this past year, but it had just idled there over winter. So if you go and you take a shovel a foot down versus like a conventional farm that had no cover crop, it didn't have anything to help retain moisture. It didn't have the buildup of organic matter or anything like that to increase water holding capacity and whatnot. Like you mentioned, 1% holds about 20,000 gallons an acre, which is huge. But it was a night and day difference. So like when you're talking about like saturation, this soil that we had was nearly saturated, where this was maybe 50% saturation or something like that. So I think there's tremendous advantages to water holding capacity in implementing some of these practices. And we've seen it on our farm, and we hope to get more data on it too. And we have plans this summer. We've got a few different teams, regenerative teams, that are coming out this summer, and they're going to take a lot more data measurements and stuff like that. In addition to that, we're certified with SCI. So we have a lot of baseline data that we're going to use and continue to measure it in the coming years as well.
Ladd, let's shift a little bit to the brand and the commercial piece. Super awesome on the agronomic piece. Learned a ton. There's probably more we can talk about, but we'll save that for episode 2. So you've had kind of the brand since, I think you said 2020, 2021. You're a 4th generation farmer, but a 1st generation CPG founder. So I guess give us a little bit more of the origin story there, and just like, what's that journey been like? It sounds like you've been rolling with potato chips the whole time. You've really focused on this more independent distribution, localized, regional kind of approach, which we actually think is great. But give us just a little bit more of the arc since founding to now. What has kind of happened and what's been the journey a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is quite the story. So if you just think, we're a farm family, zero experience in CPG. I didn't even know what CPG was, what it stood for, until like a year down into the potato chip. I didn't even know that. Like that can tell you how much I knew about CPG. I knew very little, but basically, like, we had the idea, and we've kind of always had the mentality, and that's probably inherited from being, raised as farm stock, is like, hey, we'll figure it out. We want to do it. We have interest in do it. We'll figure it out. And we're pretty limited on resources because we're in a very rural area. So we had to figure out a lot of stuff for ourselves. So we took some food processing course, food safety courses. We rented a commercial kitchen, like I mentioned before, and we got trial product out there. We got feedback. We kind of toned in our seasonings and what we wanted to do. And then eventually we put together this little facility, and we had some interested parties, but basically I'll tell you a funny story. So there was a local grocery store that they have like 4 or 5 stores. So they're just kind of a small little independent chain. But we went and pitched to them first, and they liked the product. They loved the story. And their first question was, so can we get you through KHE or UNFI? And I said, well, who's KHE? I don't know who UNFI is. That was my response. I just knew very little about distribution and everything. It was all new to me, but this was a great little retail company, and they took us into their stores. So basically, like, our first year, oh man, it was like trial by fire. We just learned stuff as we went, and it was mostly just my wife and I that kind of ran the company, and then we had a processing crew that helped us as well. But and we did a lot of we knocked door to door pretty much for a lot of retailers, restaurants, other things. So it was very grassroots type of thing and very local for the most part. So that's how we started our first year. And we started, as I mentioned, CPG was very new to me, and I thought we could do a lot more than we could, but we started out with almost 25 SKUs, which that was the dumbest decision we could have ever made. But we were overwhelmed. But so our idea is, hey, we can hit the C stores, the retailers, the food service. But when we started out, we had several organic SKUs. We had several avocado oil SKUs. We had several sunflower SKUs. And then we had all these food service SKUs. And I learned very quickly that was just not manageable from a small scale. So since then, we've significantly scaled back. But yeah, that first year was really just learning. That second year, it just took off. We pretty much quadrupled our sales that fourth year. And we had people coming and asking us for product and stuff like that. And then that third year, which was last year, we hit max capacity, and we basically can't add anything on until we get additional production capacity. But that's basically where we're at right now. But it's been a big journey. I've learned a lot, and I've learned to rely on the experts too for advice too, for consultants and advisors and stuff like that as well. But it's been a fun journey. It's been all new to me, but it's good. I think we're on a good, positive track right now.
Well, Ladd, we need you to very quickly increase your manufacturing capacity, because my sales brain is like churning right now. Like, of all the opportunities around for potato chips, I'm like, man, there's so much. And I'm on the website
Kyle's
now.
ready to sell some chips, baby.
I'm so ready to sell chips. But there's like a bunch of stuff sold out. So clearly, like, we got to increase that capacity, man.
It's so cool because potato chips, like when I think of regenerative, we love, like I mentioned before, my wife, we love cooking whole foods. That's primarily what our diet consists of. But we freaking love snacks. We eat snacks on every road trip all the time, like the majority of consumers. So potato chips and, the better for you type of potato chips, which we do, is really what got us super interested in this. So and then, I think, Kyle, you mentioned this before too, but potato chips, and I imagine they probably have a near 100% household penetration in the US. So what a great opportunity to, like, spread the regenerative message and, get inside a lot of households, get exposure.
Totally. And one thing that we haven't shared on the podcast before, and we won't mention brand names, but there was a different regenerative potato chip company that we had interviewed on the podcast, and they closed their doors after the interview, and they're like, hey, don't publish this because we're going out of business. So it is so great to be able to showcase this category with a brand who's doing it right, and we're super pumped about this. I had a secondary question I was going to ask you, but I completely lost my train of thought.
I think I know what it was. Ladd, you mentioned that you've been telling the regenerative story since the very beginning. So maybe that was the question, because that's where my mind was going, was what has that been like from the 25 SKU journey, even down to the now limited SKU journey? Like, what has it been like to tell that story from the get-go, and how's the feedback?
That wasn't it. And I want to hear the answer to that, but I remembered what it was. When my wife and I tried the purple sea salt, my wife said specifically, she's like, I like this chip because it looks like just a potato chip that is just cut very thinly and cooked. So I'm curious from a production perspective, like, are you doing anything different that is not like traditional for other potato chip companies? Because I did notice that as well. It's like, it just looks like a cross section of a potato.
Yeah. So Kyle, if you're referring to the purple potato chip, like the only thing different about that is the variety of the potatoes, the purple potato. But basically, I think the real difference comes from our story and like our sourcing. So we're trying to source, obviously we're sourcing our own potatoes at single origin, but we're sourcing very clean ingredients, better for you oil, stuff like that. And transparency and traceability is a big thing too. So like, we don't list any natural flavors. We don't list spices. We list everything out on the label. So there's nothing that a consumer can say, hey, well, what's in this? It's a very transparent and traceable process, which I think makes us unique as well. But yeah, our process for the most part, it's pretty standard. And what's so cool about potato chips is the process is very simple. It's not ultra processed. Like I'll run you through the flow chart. Like the potatoes come directly from the cellar. They get washed, they get sliced, they get cooked, they get seasoned, they get bagged. So super simplistic process, not ultra, it's minimal processing for sure, but very simplistic process. And I think that's part of what sets us apart too, is it's a very hands-on approach. We got a small factory and it's a simple process too. There's not a lot of altering or ultra processing that goes on.
Yeah, I love that you spelled that out. It sounds like something that you could do in your own home. Granted, I don't know anybody who would actually want to make their own potato chips in their own home on a regular basis. But to your point, it's not overly processed. It doesn't require like crazy technology to like re-put things together, and it's not frankenfood. It's just, it's a potato chip, which is fantastic. But I do want to give you an opportunity to answer AC's question. So AC, restate that question so we can get to the answer, because I think it's a fantastic question.
Yeah, just curious, Ladd, what it's been like to tell the regenerative story from the get-go, and kind of how that has evolved and how you've marketed it, maybe how you've had it on the packaging. We know you are about to have SCI certification, or you now do have SCI certification. So take us through kind of the regenerative messaging journey as y'all have got this thing launched and developed.
Yeah, so initially in 2021, in our store, we talked about it on the back of packs. So there's an opportunity for consumers to have a little bit of education and awareness and exposure to regenerative, but it was never a priority for us. I do not know one account that we've landed that had said, that's cool that you promote regenerative agriculture. Every account we landed was because we were like an artisan potato chip company. We were local. We had a good product that people liked it and they wanted to bring it in. But tons of, non-GMO, glyphosate free. Do you use pesticides? So it never really revolved around regenerative, which I always thought that was interesting. But I think and you guys have mentioned this several times, but there's so little consumer awareness and education around regenerative that I think we're still very early in the game. The one that I will say that has prioritized it is Whole Foods. And so we're only in a few Whole Foods accounts. We actually got approved for some additional expansion, which is awesome. We're pretty excited about that. But they are the ones that have been a little more promoting of the regenerative movement. And so working with the local forager and stuff like that. So I think definitely like moving forward, we're really going to target the natural channels. And so we want to be able to tell our regenerative story a little bit better. So that's kind of why we sought out the SCI certification. But we have told our story very much as far as regenerative agriculture, but it's never been a priority for the buyers so far. So either we need to change who we're targeting, or I'm not sure, but I think it's definitely on the cusp, like it's coming, but it hasn't been a priority yet for any of our buyers.
I mean, that's both. I don't want to say disappointing. It's interesting, and it's like a testament to the strength of your brand, right? If you don't have to rely on regeneration as like your number one attribute, then fantastic. And to your point, I think we're still sort of on the cutting edge of regenerative right now, and it's not yet fully adopted mainstream, and we're getting there. Man, I don't know. I'm lacking today. There was a really good question I had queued up, and it just totally floated out of my mind.
The universe just knows when I need to add on things to what you're saying. So let me just chime in with agree with everything you just said, and also something we talk about all the time on the show is just it's not a primary purchasing driver, and I think we're almost of the belief like it's not maybe ever going to be, especially for the vast amount of consumers. And so what you just listed off, it tastes good, it has a unique story, and it's local. Those are still things that are all valued way more than regenerative, and regenerative is this very kind of deep, nuanced topic that we need to unpack kind of into those primary purchasing drivers, because it's hard to kind of educate a consumer on it holistically and turn it into one, because it's not this binary, easy to understand thing like a lot of other claims in CPG.
Yeah, AC, I completely agree with you too. Like, I don't think it's been a priority yet, but we do get lots of feedback from consumers that say, hey, got your product, read the story, absolutely love the story about regenerative agriculture. So I know it's catching on the consumer end, at least to a certain point, just not on the buyer side. I just haven't really seen that prioritized, or even, but I think it's definitely moving that direction, which is very positive.
I remember my question, which is great. And Ladd, to your point, I think that we talk about this on a regular basis. We think that there's a loyalty attribute to regeneration. So, maybe it's not the primary purchase driver, but it gives you a different level of engagement opportunity with your consumer once they've tried the product. And that could bring them back over and over again, right? Because that is something truly unique to you in this category. But the question I wanted to ask was SCI. We've talked a lot about a variety of certifications on the show, but we have not spent a ton of time showcasing the amazing work SCI has been doing. We consider them great friends. Adam and his team are fantastic. Kristen's a rock star, but help us understand like why you want to work with SCI and how working with them has impacted both your practices on the farm and or your approach to market.
Yeah, so we're super excited to work with SCI. We actually explored several regenerative certifying bodies previously, but SCI aligned most with what we wanted to do. So we were super excited to get in a partnership with them. We've worked a lot with Adam and Megan on the brand side and Taylor on the farm side. So it's been a very unique and fun experience. Our journey, for the most part, all practices we were already implementing. So it just came down to paperwork. So we had to document everything, take some baseline tests and stuff like that in order to get certified. But there was quite a bit of back and forth there, which was very good. What I really appreciate about SCI, probably the thing that I appreciate the most, is context. I don't know a regenerative certifying body that takes context so much into consideration as SCI. Because, for example, regenerative production in potato crops is so much different than corn or soybeans, or if you got grassland that you're grazing cattle, totally different. And although you can apply the same principles, obviously you're still targeting those same principles, they're going to be implemented completely different than a different operation. And SCI understands that, which I've really appreciated that. They say, okay, well, in your operation, what can we do to implement this practice? How's that going to look? Because it's going to look different than a corn or a soybean or a cattle operation or whatever it is. So that's one thing I've really appreciated. They've been good. SCI has been working with like Whole Foods to recognize their certification too. And I think they're pretty close in the approval process. But I think they're going to be a great partner moving forward and helping align with retailers and get their certification accepted by retailers as well.
I love that answer, and I want to elaborate a little bit on one piece there. And it sounded, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but my interpretation of what you just shared was, instead of like a top-down, hey, this is what you have to do and this is how you have to do it, it's, hey, here's the principle and here's what we're looking to achieve. Let's have an open dialogue about what we can do together to ensure that we're ticking that box, right? So is that more of how it has worked for you, or am I misinterpreting that?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So basically like they have like a process and an outcome approach, but it seems like some certifying bodies just have a process approach. So if you're not doing these certain methods or certain processes, you're not going to be able to get certified. But where at the end result, I think you have to balance both of them. Obviously, there has to be certain practices that you are implementing, certain processes, certain methods in agriculture. But at the end of the day, if you have the results, if you have the increasing organic matter, water holding capacity, biology, diversity, if you're seeing all these metrics improve, that means in fact that you are regenerating the soil, even though my practices might be a little bit different than the cattle rancher down the road or the corn farmer, whoever it is. So yeah, I've appreciated that about SCI.
Ladd, you got a ton going on here, man. I'm curious, kind of like, to me, when we talk about these vertically integrated brands, it's almost like three separate businesses, especially if you own the manufacturing, right? You have the farming operations, you have the manufacturing operations, and you have the brand operations. And in a lot of ways, those need to be funded differently. In a lot of ways, sometimes you have to fund them the same, or, there's all kinds of corporate structure and capitalization kind of thoughts and processes there. But how have you funded this whole thing, and what does that look like in the future? Curious if you could share some thoughts on that.
For sure, yeah. So up to this point, we're self-funded. My wife and I, we are the only owners of our operation. So we own all the equipment, the processing facility, the whole brand itself has all been self-funded.
Wow.
And it's been quite the learning experience. Like I mentioned, we're very relatively small still, but we have the opportunity to significantly scale up. We have so much interest in our brand from distributors and retailers and co-packer inquiries, private label inquiries, just based on, that's a big thing about some of our regenerative certification. We've had lots of private label inquiries as well. So there's so much potential. And in addition to that, I don't want to get too crazy because hopefully I learned from my past history, but we do want to implement maybe a couple additional SKUs that have a separate target. But we're really looking to expand. That's what we want to do. We have to do it carefully because obviously capital is hard to come by. So what we really want this to be is a good kind of a cooperative or a collaborative project. So what our goal is, we want to bring in neighboring and outside farmers and expose them to some of our regenerative practices, allow them to come in, be able to pay them a premium for regeneratively raised potatoes, and kind of help this regenerative movement in our area. That's really what we want to do. The issue that we're having right now is how to fund it exactly. So these next few weeks, we do have some actual conversations with some potential partnerships. The only issue or hesitancy that we have is a lot of these potential partnerships aren't necessarily prioritizing regenerative agriculture. It's more so a business for them. So we're hoping that doesn't get diluted at all, because that's really what we want to do. We want this to be a good project for the area and local economy. And there's so much potential and interest from neighboring farmers, but there's not an adequate outlet for regenerative potatoes, which we could provide if we're able to scale up. But that's what we want to do, because really at the end, one of the biggest incentives for farmers to change practices comes down to show me the money. What are the incentives? What kind of premiums can I get? And that's really the direction we would like to head. But as far as expansion, we have a couple things on the table right now, but that's currently what our current status is.
So like you mentioned expansion, I'm curious from like a future perspective, you said maybe a couple new SKUs. We've talked about capacity constraints right now, but do you have any sense of like, here are the new SKUs we want to add, here are the markets we want to focus on next? Like you want to double down in food service, or you want to explore new retail distribution. What does the future hold, and how are you prioritizing those different growth opportunities? Because it sounds like you've got quite a handful of opportunities available right now. So I'm curious to understand like how you're thinking about the best way to grow the business. And really, like, to your point, it's not really about growing the business. It's about how do we get more people growing regenerative potatoes?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle, for the question. So for sure, like right as soon as we have expansion, so we've put so many things on the table right now that we've just had to put on the table. But what our plan is, as far as retail, we want to target the natural channel, because I think that is probably the natural channel is what's going to prioritize regenerative certifications and some of the other certifications that we carry the most. So we want to continue to expand with Whole Foods, hopefully, which I said they approved us for some expansion later this year. And then we want to target additional natural retailer chains as well. So I think that's where our priority will be. In addition, food service. I freaking love food service. It's so awesome. But my experience so far is it pays well. There's not a lot of discounts. There's not these big promotions that you have to do. We haven't had any discounts or anything, any spoils or anything from the 3 years that we've been in food service. But then, like, for example, on the retail side, we onboarded with a large retail distributor earlier this year in March. We've delivered 15 POs. We haven't been paid for one yet. So it's just crazy. So I would really like to grow both on the food service side and the retail side, but I want to focus in certain channels that I think we can have the best growth. Like we really got to be aware of slotting fees and free fills and all that stuff. That's something that I think hopefully the natural channel can assist us with a little bit.
Yeah, the state of the go-to-market in CPG for everyone is just not in a good spot, and your downstream actors are really taking advantage of brands, especially small brands, and not understanding the context that they live in whatsoever. And you add on top of that the fact that most regenerative brands are already doing extra work, investing more in their business, investing more in their supply chain, selling at a premium, and the economics don't make sense. And this is one of many examples now we've had where people just say, hey, look, as a business operator, like, food service is a much more attractive channel from a current business and a growth perspective. And can't blame you there, because, we have to fix some of these really core issues, both for regenerative brands and non-regenerative brands, because it's a mess right now. Not to derail us, I'm sure we could spend a whole hour on that, but it's a sad state of affairs at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's in a really good direction. Like, I think we really just want to prioritize those natural retailers that are really that they have a priority to land or to bring in regenerative products and stuff like that. So I think it's a very bright and optimistic future, but just like doing that carefully, being careful of what retailers, how quickly we expand. Are we going deep? Are we going wide? What are we doing there? And then food service has been awesome too. So we want to just grow food service, I think, as quick as we can, because we get great exposure that way. And it's been a great return on our investment as well.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And this is one of those recurring themes that continues to pop up on episode after episode for the brands who have played in food service. It can be a profit driving channel that can help to fund the retail growth when the time comes. Yep. And to your point, Ladd, like, if you go for like national distribution across the country at a handful of retailers in 1 year, that upfront cost is so significant with all the free fills, with all the slotting, with all the distributor required introductory promotions. Like, it is so hard to maintain some level of net revenue coming in the door. So I think you're super, it's a really good strategy to kind of creep your way through retail, let food service fund that, and maybe tackle like the right retailer in the natural channel for 1 year. And then the next year go for the next one, because that way you're not dealing with all those upfront costs for all of them at the same time, because it'll just suck all the money right out of the operation.
Absolutely. 100% agree, Kyle. That's why, like, we really strategically want to grow. We want to be in the right doors, the right places, make sure our velocities are good. And then food service is going well too, but we want to be very aware and cautious, although optimistic, but we want to tread with caution as far as how quickly we grow. We're self-funded. We want to make sure we got good cash flow and we can keep things moving.
And that's the whole point of this podcast, is what you've already mentioned earlier, Ladd, just about like the brand growing can be a vehicle for more regenerative potato growing adoption. And that's like the whole point I think we're trying to make across all the episodes and across all the work we do. But to do that, the business of the brand has to thrive and grow profitably and smartly, right? And so you have to kind of protect yourself from getting over your skis. And if the brand never exists, you're never going to have any of that impact on the land. And, we feel like sometimes people look super upstream, focus on the Brax adoption, and don't figure out that commercial lens. And then we have a bunch of people figuring out the commercial lens that don't have the right funding or the right growth opportunity to then support the agriculture adoption. So, definitely some anomalies there, like yourself, that are doing the right work the right way, that are having a great impact. And hopefully we'll continue to see that across the board, across a lot of different brands and commodities.
Absolutely. 100% agree, AC.
Where in Idaho are you?
We are in southern Idaho, so probably a little closer to southeastern Idaho.
Just east of like Twin Falls area.
Yeah, pretty close to the Twin Falls area. Yep, exactly. Yeah, if you're familiar with Southern Idaho.
Okay.
Nice.
I'm going to come visit. That's why I'm asking. I'm going to drive over.
Nice.
I'm going to help you grow some stuff. When I say help, I'm going to learn from you and just like hold a shovel. So,
dude, come down. We got plenty of people coming down this summer. We're excited about. We got teams coming down to do like nutrient analysis and nutrient density analysis and soil testing, all that stuff. So we're excited. It's going to be a fun summer.
Hell yeah. Well, that's a good segue into our final question, Ladd, which we know you're aware of if you've listened to some episodes, but we'd love to get your take on it, which is how do we get Regen Brands to have 50% market share by 2050?
You know, I've heard that question so many times and there's been so many good answers that I feel like I could just piece together what everybody has said and like aggregate it and it would suffice. But I think like it's kind of unique because I can speak from the farmer's perspective and from the brand perspective, which I think is a little bit unique. But like from the farmer's side, in order to help like the regenerative supply chain grow, and I think policy is such a big thing. And there are some things in the Farm Bill that are like headed in the right direction, like the Climate Smart Grant, the commodity, the money that's going through there to incentivize like cover crop and sustainable ag adoption and stuff like that. But a shift in policy that's incentivizing regenerative agriculture to a point where farmers want to do it. I think that's a huge part of it. And then the other part of it is like working downstream to upstream. So instead of farm to table, it's table to farm. So the consumers that are prioritizing it on their table, you know, on their plates. And then obviously it's just working up the supply chain. Retailers see a demand for it. They're requesting it from brands and manufacturers. And I think that's the way it has to go. And a big part of it too, which is probably a little controversial, I think too, is, you know, like the US is so accustomed to like cheap food, like cheap in the essence of like nutrient density and cheap in the essence of like less expensive. I think there has to be like a slight mind shift there of being willing to pay a slight premium for regenerative brands, because at the end of the day, if the farmer is not getting paid a premium, there is very little incentive for them to change. There are far and few between that like want to change and adopt practices that are more for soil health. But at the end of the day, it's more about, you know, their bottom line and profitability. So yeah, a change in policy and consumer adoption and preference, I think would definitely be a big thing.
Well, I think you're spot on. And I think you're kind of touching on like a cultural piece of like the food culture in the United States. And that's something we haven't talked about too much. I think it's popped up on maybe 2 or 3 episodes, but I think you're spot on. And I don't know what the answer is, like how we get people to shift the way they think about food, not just from a impact on the ground perspective, but impact on human health perspective. To me, it almost feels like there needs to be like a really great, like A-list actor movie with like an amazing love story, but also happens to revolve around this question of food, you know? I don't know if there's any movie producers out there who want to try to figure out how to do that, but like maybe that's what we need. I don't know. But I think you're right. Like this, I just finished The End of Craving. I'll talk about this book for weeks, I'm sure. But they talk about the food culture in Italy and how they consume huge quantities of like meat and pasta and fat. And they're super healthy people because they're eating real unprocessed food, you know? And it's here in the US, we focus so much on like diet and exercise. And like, we still are like one of the most obese countries in the world. And it's really not like a lack of effort. It's a lack of incentivization for, you know, good agricultural practices and creating good, real healthy food. That was a huge expansive monologue that probably didn't make much sense, but long story short, I hear what you're saying.
Amen,
and
dude,
it resonated with
it.
me.
That was
and
great.
maybe something of that made some kind of sense to someone.
That was great, man. Yeah. Now you can go eat your chips. Ladd, this has been awesome. Really appreciate it.
Open this bag right here. Like, this is real. Like, it's happening.
We got some ASMR chip bag opening for the audience to end the episode.
Last thing. For any listeners who want to learn more, check out rootschips.com. Pick some up. Like, I'm so stoked for what you're doing, Ladd. This is awesome. And thank you so much for the time, man.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, appreciate you guys. You guys are doing awesome work. I think it's great. Love the podcast. Love the education awareness. Great job, guys.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website.
Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.